I am somewhat considered like a reader, just a little bit, but did come across I came across this book. I mean, do you have kids or nephews or nieces that actually read this book? It's a pretty cool book. It really is for kids. I came across this one page where it has the fliporama, where you would hold the page on one side and the other side you just flip it. And it actually makes like a simple kind of animation. It was actually like frames per second on a video. Well, technically this is going to be like 2 frames per second, flipping the pages left and right. And that's sort of like what it is for video. Talking about frames per second on a video, I mean, there's a majority of different kinds. There's 25, there's 30, there's 60, there's 120, there's even 240. And of course, the higher cameras out there have higher frame rates too, which is amazing. And I mean, if you just think about it, 240 frames per second, taking still images 240 times per second, that is really something. There's a lot of discussion in the internet if ever you would have to, or if it's better to record in 25 frames or 30, and what is that, 23.987 something. 25 frames, 30 frames, 60, 120. They all do something different towards video editing. In the internet, there's always all these other types of videos where you should definitely shoot in 30 frames per second. No, you should definitely shoot at 25. No, you should definitely shoot at 60. 25 and 30, they're pretty much the same. They do have some technical differences between the two, of course, because of course we all have to think about the 180 golden rule, which is for the shutter speed, the frames per second. Depending on which frame per second you're using, you would double the amount for your shutter speed. Like if you were to shoot on 25 frames per second, shutter speed's always at 50. Or higher, a bit higher, that's fine, totally fine. And of course for 30 is 60, 120, 240, and so on and so on. You get the point. And there's just a whole lot of different kinds of things that you can do with higher frame rates. I mean, it's all by preference or whatever you feel like using. I mean, if you're used to using 25 frames per second, use that in your timeline. 30, use that in your timeline too. 25 and 30 are pretty much, to me, in my opinion, is pretty much the same. But now, of course, getting into a higher frame rate is pretty much different, and you actually capture a lot of frames with 60 or 120 or 240. But making videos like these is something different, because I don't think I would ever use 60 frames per second with audio. Mostly what I use for 60 frames per second or 120 is to slow motion. You can meddle around with time. You can slow it down, massively slow it down if you're using 120. You can speed up the time if ever you want to. But of course, having the 25 frames per second or 30 frames per second, you still have the natural blur towards your videos. Mostly of what I can think of, shooting for 60 frames per second or higher, you would actually shoot some stuff that is actually stuff that the human eye can't even capture. For example, mostly of like the elements of the earth, like water, fire, and a lot of those things that you can actually slow down time and actually get the bigger picture of what happens slowly. Because if everything goes fast, everything is just a blur with the human eye. It just gives like a different kind of perspective whenever you'd have to set like a different frame rate for 60 or 120. And you know what? It's all different. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can do with the frame rates. And Talking about gaming, actually, the higher the frame rate, the better the experience you are having with playing that game. If you're playing COD or even Minecraft, having higher frame rates, it is such a better experience to play that video game. But of course, if you're trying to record something in real life, 24, 25, 30, those are the best frame rates that you can use because they all have that natural blur when you record your videos. But then again, for 60 and 120, those are the types where you would have to think ahead and know that you would want to slow down that footage. Like I said earlier about the elements of the earth: water, fire, air. I don't know if you could see air. Of course, rumbling rocks for earth, for dirt. And then actually you can do some great B-roll footage with product photography or product videography with a higher frame rate of what I think. And it's something useful and it's something to think about. All of that came from this book, Dogman. Frames per second. It is something to look about, and it just requires a lot of practice, a lot of experimenting, a lot of seeing what you can get used to. If you want to shoot 60 frames per second throughout your whole video, shoot it in 60 frames. I mean, it's just like that one of those movies. What other movies? Gemini Man. I mean, they shot most of the videos over there for 60 frames per second, and it kind of looks, futuristic. Kind of looks like a video game, right? Because there's not that much of a blur, not that much of a natural blur towards those videos, and that is something to account for. And of course, having the lower the frame rate, the lower the shutter speed's gonna get, and that's why most of the time I like to shoot in 25 frames per second. So then again, there's a lot of different kinds of things that you can do with these different types of frame rates, and there's not even a wrong answer to it. There's not really. I mean, if you can do it in 60 frames per second, do it in 60 frames. If you can do it in 120, do it in 120. It just requires a lot of practice, a lot of experimenting, like I said, and you would actually be able to do it. Just go for it, and see what happens. So that's it for now. I mean, it's just a simple kind of a concept between, when I was going through this book with the Flipperama stuff. I'm surprised about how many things that you can find online between frame rates. I mean, 25 is better. 30 is better. No, 160 is way better. Or 60, yeah. I mean, let me know what you think. I mean, what you record in. Is it in 25? Is it in 30? Is it in 10? Is it in 2 frames per second? And catch you guys in the next one, all right? Bye.